Hello students, welcome to today's lesson. Today we will be discussing war under the unit War, Peace and World Order. It is very important for us to understand what war is as the essence of the unit, but more importantly, it is important to understand war because war is part and parcel of international relations. And in fact, if you look at the study of international relations, it grew out of strategic studies whose essence was to study war. So war and peace have been part and parcel of human history, and for as long as human beings have existed, so has war and peace. There's never a moment in history where you find that you cannot talk about either peace or war. So you find that human beings have existed in either of those two conditions, where they're either at war or they are at peace. And so you find that Charles Tilly argues that war made the state and the state made war. I don't think there's any state which you can find that has came into existence without war or conflict. So for instance, if you look at Kenya, we became a state by fighting for our independence, or going back to get our independence. We were able to become Kenya because we are trying to end colonialism. So you find that states have been able to become what they are majorly because they went through a state of war or a state of conflict. So human interaction can either be peaceful or conflictual. And because states are made up of individuals, then it also means that the interaction between states is either peaceful or conflictual. So it is very important then to understand these two particular concepts. But when it comes to war, it is not just a human condition. It is not just that individuals, by virtue of interacting with one another, then we conflict with one another, but it is also a societal and a global condition. We have conflicts within societies, we have conflicts within countries, we have conflicts between countries, and we even have conflicts between among many countries. So you find that the reason as to why we are studying even this unit, War, Peace and World Order, is because the world order that we have today is as a result of what happened during the war, or the wars that have come about in the international system. So you find that the seminal changes in international relations and in global politics can be credited to war. For instance, there is the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia that came after the 30-year war. The 1648 Treaty of Westphalia is what is credited for the formation of the modern state system. So you cannot talk of the modern state system without the Treaty of Westphalia, which again came after 30 years war. So that shows you that war actually defined or redefined the international system. Another example is the League of Nations was formed after the First World War, again to show you that the First World War had an impact on international politics. Again, the United Nations was formed after the Second World War. So you find that the two major wars, that is First World War and the Second World War, have actually been very transformative in this day and age in terms of the current type of global politics that we have, particularly because of the League of Nations and then now the United Nations. For instance, you cannot talk of international relations and not talk of the United Nations, because the United Nations is at the heart of international politics. And then another thing is that if you look at the end of the Cold War, it's what launched the unipolar system, where we currently have one superpower. During the Cold War, we had two superpowers, that is the US and the USSR. But after the Cold War, it changed the dynamics, it changed the global order, and now what we have is a unipolar system where we have one superpower, that is America. So therefore, it's important then to understand the importance of war. It's not necessarily that we are advocating for war, but we're just acknowledging that war is part and parcel of our lives. I know there are some we're going to discuss it when we're discussing liberalism, that look at war and say that you can actually eliminate, or we can find ways to eliminate, or we can find ways to cooperate and what have you. But at the end of the day, war is part and parcel of our international system, and how individuals and how states interact with one another. So let's go into defining war and trying to understand the nature of war. Again, a reminder, when it comes to social science, concepts, there is no one standard definition of war or a concept. There's no one standard definition of a concept. There's also no one standard nature of a thing, because you find that just like human beings, the way you can be identified and defined in so many ways, in the same sense when it comes to social sciences, because they are as a result of human beings and the lives that we live, then you find that there are various definitions and perspectives and natures that go into defining or explaining one particular concept. So when it comes to war, Karl von Clausewitz argued that war is a continuation of policy or politics by other means. You find that there are various ways to meet your national interests. There are various ways to come up with policy. So you can come up with a policy in the normal way, go through parliament and what have you. You can also come up with a foreign policy in terms of how it is going to define how you will interact with other states. But you find that there are times, and again, these policies, both domestic and foreign policy, dictate or help a state in its business internally and externally. But there are instances where the only alternative, and a lot of the times it ends up being the last resort, that they have to follow through with war. And so you find therefore that war is also a policy, and you find that states can actually use war as its foreign policy. They can use intervention, military intervention as part of its policy. So when Karl von Clausewitz was talking about war being a continuation of policy or war being a continuation of politics, you find that a lot of the times, and we're going to discuss in the next point, whereby Mill argued that without political aims, war is mindless. So that shows you the political nature of war, tying back to what Clausewitz was arguing, that at the end of the day, politics is at the heart of every war. And so therefore you find, going back to what Mill was talking about, that without political aims, war is a mindless distraction and possession of military means in peacetime. And so you find that it becomes a waste. States do not just go to war for the sake of war. At the end of the day, there must be, whatever the reason, it must add on, or it must have an impact, or the reason must be political in nature. And so you find that once political aims have been specified by the state, then it becomes then necessary then to use at that point the state can therefore then choose to use the military. Another way to define war is that it is a contest, keyword being contest, between states carried out by force. So contest, states, and force. So contestation, it meaning that somebody wants to emerge the winner. The second thing is that the states have to be part and parcel of that war. And then finally, the use of force. War is not peaceful in nature. So you find that whether the reason is for self-defense, whether it's for revenging insults, whether it is for redressing wrongs, whatever the reason is for a state to go to war, at the end of the day, they want to establish superiority. And that's why I was talking about contestation. They want to have dominion. And that again goes back to the whole idea of contestation. Another point about war is that it involves the use of force or the threat to use force. So you do not necessarily have to go and outrightly wage the war, but even threatening to use force is considered an act of aggression, an act of war. Wilmot argues that man made war in his own image, that individuals, by virtue of interacting with one another, we are either bound to have peaceful interactions or conflictual interactions. And these conflictual interactions between individuals can also be translated to the states. So even when states are going to war with one another, they are doing it, and it is reflecting the nature of the individual. And that's why Wilmot talks about man-made war in his own image. So the way in which a society makes war is a projection of that society, because you find that a country's culture also has an impact on the way they are going to wage war. A country's culture, a country is also political culture, because you find that there are countries, for instance, a country like Russia is very, very aggressive. So you find that the type of war they are going to wage, for instance, as compared to a country like Kenya, might be a bit different because of the cultures that back those two countries. Another way to look at war is that it is organized violence, not disorganized. You don't just wake up one day and decide you're going to go to war. You have to, there must be meticulous planning. So organized violence carried out by political units. The political units can be a state, The political units can be a militia. The political unit, so it's not just, it is both state and non-state actors, but those states or non-state actors must be political units. So therefore, when it comes to war, according to Rousseau, war is therefore not a relationship between man and man, but between state and state. Because what happens is that the military personnel in those states, in as much as they are fighting each other, they are fighting each other in the name of the states that they represent. And so therefore you find that individuals become enemies by accident. They become enemies by virtue of the fact that their countries are enemies. But once the war ends, then they become friends once again. If the countries choose to become friends, then they also become friends, and they can also become allies. So therefore you find that soldiers fight not in their own name, but they fight in the name of a political unit. They fight in the name of their state. Now Kenneth Waltz argues that in as much as we were discussing earlier that war is about contestation, that we want to establish superiority and dominion, and we want to win and emerge the winners and leaders, Kenneth Waltz, however, argues and warns that when you ask who has won in a war, because again, there must be a winner and there must be a loser. But according to Kenneth Waltz, when you ask who has won in a war, it's like asking who has won in an earthquake. At the end of the day, when there's an earthquake, everybody loses. But some people lose more than others. So when it comes to war, everybody loses. You lose lives, you lose resources, you lose time, you lose energy, you lose so many things. But now the winner is only a winner because they have relatively lost less than the loser. The loser is only a loser because they have lost relatively more than the winner. So everybody is a loser. It is just that the relative loss is different, whereby one loses more and therefore becomes the loser, and one loses less and therefore becomes the winner. Now, it's very important to look at how the theories in IR try to conceptualize what war is. When it comes to liberalism, and remember liberalism is what facilitated the formation of the League of Nations, it argues that war can be avoided because of people's good nature. In fact, when Woodrow Wilson was campaigning for the formation of the League of Nations, after the end of the First World War, he was arguing that we don't need to go to war with one another. We are good people, surely. We can find other ways to sort out our issues. So he looks at it and says that, you know, we can be guided by moral considerations. We don't always have to be guided by this whole idea of wanting to dominate one another. The other thing that liberalism argues is that military power is not the only form of power, because it's very easy when, again, if you look at the Treaty of Westphalia, and that generation, at that time, states used to become powerful and kingdoms used to become powerful by going to war with one another. So you go to war with another country, you expand your territory. You go to war with another country, expand and get more territory. Go to war with another country, expand and get more territory. But now, when it comes to liberalism, they argue that military power is not the only source of power. You can find power through other means. You can find power through your economy. You can find power through your diplomacy. You can find power by using your natural resources. So states, liberalism urges states to seek out other forms of, or other elements that they can get power from. Another thing is that they argue that it is not just conflict that shapes international affairs. Because if states are so concerned about conflict, then it means that they're naturally going to be drawn to conflict. Rather, cooperation is key for international politics, because if you even look at it, yes, we have the major wars that have happened, and we always have in conflicts here and there, but we relatively live in more peace than we live in conflict. So therefore, cooperation actually takes the day more than conflict takes the day. So he was looking at it and saying that states' interactions and relationships can actually be defined by cooperation rather than being defined by conflict. Another thing is that international law and international institutions can help eliminate war, because remember, again, in the international system there is no Leviathan, so there's an element of anarchy. But what happens with these two, that is international law and international institutions such as the UN, they come in as quasi-Leviathan to instill order, to bring in cooperation, to foster conflict resolution, trust, interdependence, and prosperity. Because, for instance, look at what we have in the East African community. community. Uganda and Kenya had an issue over Migingo Island. But when you look at the greater scheme of things, we would rather stay at peace and figure out how to resolve the issue of Migingo Island, because at the end of the day, territorial integrity is one of the reasons why a state can go to war to defend its territory. But when you do the calculation, we will lose out on more if we went to war with Uganda over Migingo Island than if we chose to cooperate. And one of the reasons why we are cooperating is because we are all members of the East African community. Liberalism also advocates for democratic peace theory. And the reason they advocate for democratic peace theory and they advocate for democracy and good systems of governance is they argue that democracy virtually never fights with one another. So you might ask then, how is it that we have so many wars in the international system? For instance, America as a democratic state has fought so many wars. But the reality of the matter is that the war it fights, or the wars it goes to majority of the time, are not with other democratic states. So therefore you find that because how democracy brings peace is that, number one, they must be, a president cannot just wake up one morning, or a prime minister cannot wake up, a leader cannot wake up one morning and decide to wage war. They have to go through particular levels of approval. Number two, you find that because of democracy, it means that people are very keen and leaders are very keen to always win the vote or to have majority support of the citizens. So it means then that if they go to war and the citizens don't support, they're likely to lose the election. Look at what happened in America after going into Iraq. The government, people lost confidence in the government. And so you find then it was very easy then to switch from having a Republican, that is George Bush, to going into having a Democrat, that is President Obama, because he promised to fix what George Bush had done in America. The other thing is that liberalism advocates for collective security. And the reason as to why it advocates for collective security is that states act as a community of states. More importantly, by virtue of acting as a community of state, it means that states tend to avoid unilateral actions. That state cannot just decide to go to war at any particular point. In as much as they are sovereign nations, they have to put a lot of consideration. And then again, you find that collective security acts as a deterrence measure, because remember what the motto of collective security is. An attack on one is an attack on all. So you find that nobody wants to be seen as an aggressor. And those are basically what liberalism, that is how the lens that liberalism looks at war. Now the next theory is realism. Now realism, again, remember, is an antithesis of liberalism. Now whereas liberalism believes in the good nature of individuals, realists, on the other hand, look at the human nature as being selfish, competitive, and dominating. And because states are a conglomerate of individuals, then also states are selfish, competitive, and dominating. And that's why you find that they are going to war with one another, because in the same way that individuals conflict, so do also states conflict with one another. Another thing is that they say that how realistically a state perceives its national interest is at the core of its national security. So anything, whatever threatens a country's national interest, whatever the national interest can be, it could be economic, however a state defines its economic interest, whatever threatens that economic interest then becomes a security concern. And states can wage war to protect that security concern, that particular national interest. Another thing is that realists believe that the inevitability of war creates a security dilemma. That is, war is inevitable. Basically, war is part and parcel of the state's international system. So here what they look at this inevitability creating the security dilemma is that the more power a state obtains, or the more power a state seeks to obtain, particularly in terms of its defense capabilities, having a big military, having a strong military, having a prepared military, it sends signals to other states to also behave in the same way. So other states become insecure, and they also want to build a strong military, and they also want to have a prepared military, and they also want to have a big military. So then you have a security dilemma where every state is always insecure and trying to gain relative power when it comes to the military and the security, and that's how the security dilemma comes about. Another thing is that realists believe in national security rather than collective security. Now, their issue with collective security is that collective security, they look at it in terms of you are depending on somebody else, and that in itself creates a level of vulnerability. So for realists, you would rather build your own military. You would rather secure yourself. You'd rather have your own capabilities rather than depend on somebody else. Because the thing with collective security is that today everybody is a potential friend. Tomorrow everybody is a potential threat. So you'd rather first and foremost ensure that your national security has been taken care of in terms of having a strong military, the right numbers, the right weapons, and what have you, just ensuring that you're secure within your country. Then even if you choose to go the collective security way, it will just be an added bonus, not necessarily that you are relying on collective security. They also discuss the anarchical nature of the international system. And because of this anarchical nature, because remember, anarchy means that war can be waged at any time. It means that states are always ready. Again, going back to the security dilemma. So it means that it drives states to always use military force and to go to war. They also believe, unlike liberalists, that international organizations and international law have no power or force. They only exist as long as the states accept them. Remember, for liberalists, they believe that these international organizations and international law are very essential in ending, not just in ensuring there is peace, but in ending war. But for realists, first of all, war is part and parcel of human life, and war is part and parcel of the international system. So these two quasi-leviathans, that is international organization and international law, really have no power over the state, because at the end of the day, it is the political will of the state to give these two power, and the state can choose not to give these two power, and they can choose to flaunt international law, like the US did when it went into Iraq against the UN Security Council's approval. The other thing is morality. And when it comes to morality, of course, whenever people talk about war, they always look at it as an immoral thing. But at the end of the day, when it comes to realists, they are not keen on moralistic considerations. For them, the end justifies the means. So morality has no place in politics. So if a state is required to use war to gain whatever interest it wants to meet, then it has to use war. So in fact, Mashima argues that leaders may be moral. As an individual, and you become a leader, you may be very, very moral. But at the end of the day, if you are too concerned about moral concerns when you're coming up with foreign policy, you'll find that other states are not doing the same. So at the end of the day, leaders then speak the language of power and not that of principle. Principle meaning morality. And so you find, for instance, I always ask this question. Imagine you're the president, and there's a flight that is coming into your country, and the most wanted terrorist in the world is in that plane, and the plane is supposed to land in your country. Are you going to wait for the plane to land in your country, then you apprehend the terrorist, or are you going to shoot down the plane? I know it sounds like something wrong to imagine that you're going to shoot down a plane full of many people, but that is also a consideration. Now, the purpose of war. Why do people go to war? What drives states to go to war? And you have to understand that the purpose of war is not war in itself. People or states go to war, number one, to defeat and disable an enemy. So you must have an enemy, so you're trying to defeat that enemy or disable that enemy. States also go to war for economic gain. Maybe there's a resource you want from that state, or there's a resource you're fighting over. Territorial gain, I talked about that earlier, where you find that kingdoms used to be established, by conquering others. In fact, the Roman Empire was so strong because it conquered so many territories in North Africa, in the Middle East, in Europe. So that's one of the reasons as to why the Roman Empire was very powerful. And then also, states go to war to project power, for optics, to show that they are powerful, So it is a matter of them just trying to mold the perceptions that other states have of it. Now, according to Hedley Bull, when he was discussing the purpose of war, he also tried to understand it from the perspective, from different perspectives, and he looked at it from 3 different perspectives. The first one is the individual state. So keeping in mind the reason as to why states go to war, now as we're going into the perspectives of war, he looked at the individual state and he said that war is an instrument of policy, going back to what Karl von Clausewitz was saying, that war is just a continuation of politics, that you find that states can achieve their national interests using war. The second way is, the second perspective is the international system. By virtue of states interacting with one another, surely, just like individuals, they are bound to go to war with one another. And then finally, the society of states. Now, this society of states is a bit more peaceful. It is alive to the fact that war is part and parcel of humanity, but it tries to ensure that we do not necessarily go into war with one another. And so therefore, that's where the international law and international organizations come in. Now, what are the causes of war? What causes individuals, or what causes states to go to war? Number one is human nature, because we are evil and want to dominate one another. Then you find that in the same way, states are evil and want to dominate one another according to realists. So therefore, you find that they find themselves just going into war with one another. And in fact, Morgenthau argues that optimists have misunderstood politics because they have misestimated human nature. This is the real error of liberals. Again, going back to the liberal realist argument, because according to Morgenthau, who happens to be a realist, he looks at it and says human beings are selfish and we are bound to go to war with one another. So the idea that liberals imagine that we are good natured and we are just going to cooperate with one another, that is not the case. The second cause of war is state, and particularly in terms of national interest. War is a way for states to actually gain their national interest. The third one is the international system, that the international system is by nature anarchical, whereby you find that the threat to use force is very alive. The other thing is that states are also hyper aware, and that's where the security dilemma I talked about comes in. And so you find that by virtue of the international system being anarchical, then the reality of war is very alive. The other reason that people go to war is religion, and a lot of wars have been fought in the name of religion, both in the past and in the present. For instance, if you look at the Christian crusades that were being launched, they were done in the name of spreading Christianity. So that goes to show you that religion also causes war. The other one is defense of liberties. Defense of liberties, for instance, when Kenya was trying to gain back our independence, when the US was also trying to gain back its independence, and many other countries just trying to gain back their independence. That is why we're talking about, the end of colonialism and gaining back of liberties. There's also the regime types. Certain regimes have a propensity to go to war more than others. And that's why we're discussing the democratic peace theories. Democracies have a lower chance of going to war as compared to authoritarian regimes, because for authoritarian regimes, you have either one person or an elite small group of people making decisions. For democracy, there are certain levels of approval, and also public opinion matters. That's why it becomes a bit more difficult for democracies to go to war. Then ideology. Again, just like the types of regimes, certain political beliefs favor conflict or war more than others. For instance, if you look at Marxism, Marxism believes in a revolution, and not a revolution of the minds, a revolution, a bloody revolution. And so you find therefore that certain ideologies, or the way because ideologies determine how people think. And when you determine how people think, it also means that you determine how people act. And so because of that, you find then that certain ideologies have a propensity of war as compared to other types of ideologies. Then the final cause of war is economic, is the economy, people and resources. Individuals and societies and states fight or go to war because of resources. For instance, it could be a shared resource, and that's why we talk about the tragedy of the commons. You're either fighting over a lake, or fighting over oil, or fighting over. So you find that resources, and by the virtue of the fact that a lot of the times resources are scarce, and also they tend to be quite valuable, so you find that the economy and resources are also a reason as to why states go to war. Now let's try to understand the types of war that exist. And there are various types of war. The first one is interstate war. Now, this is between two or more states. So Kenya can go to war with another country. For instance, Kenya could have decided to go to war with Uganda. The Great Wars, that is the First World War and the Second World War, are also examples of interstate wars. Then we also have intra-state wars. Now, intrastate wars are wars between groups within the states, with or without international participation, like what is happening in Syria. There's an intra-state war. So you find the government, there's the government fighting another group within the country. Then we also have total or absolute war. Now here, in total or absolute war, combatants use every resource available to destroy. It's not just about killing the enemy, but they also seek to destroy the social fabric of the enemy. And it is very highly destructive, and it is characterized by mass civilian casualties, and it is also characterized by violation of human rights. The Great Wars, that is the First World War and Second World War, which were interstate wars, they also fall in the category of total wars. Then the other type of war is limited war. When it comes to limited war, this is between professional armies who seek to achieve a specific goal. Once that goal is achieved, then they are supposed to end the war. And a lot of the time it is more of an intervention. So you find, for instance, the Persian Gulf War in 1990 and to 1991, where America went into, and its allies went into Kuwait. They wanted to remove Iraqi troops from Kuwait. So they had a specific intention, and when that was achieved, then they pulled out. And that's what also happens for intervention, a military intervention. Because, for instance, when Kenya went into Somalia under AMISOM, we had a very clear idea of what we wanted to achieve. Once that is achieved, of course, there's a whole lot of politics that goes into that. But once that is achieved, then ideally AMISOM is supposed to pull out. The other type of war is guerrilla war. Now, this one or you find that combatants can either be big or small, and there is use of armed militia units rather than professional organized armies. And a lot of guerrilla fighters tend to seek to either topple a government or to gain independence. For instance, if you look at Kenya, when you were trying to recapture back our independence, the Mau Maus were part of guerrilla war. And a lot of African nations that went through colonialism had guerrilla war as one of the ways to actually gain their independence. And then finally, we have civil war. Now, when it comes to civil war, this is war fought within a single country. Is fought within a single country between or among different groups. Now, these different groups can be ethnic, they can be racial. The reason could be because of one feels they are minority, another one feels they are majority. It could be because of politics. Again, you find that a lot of the times the government tend to recognize one group and don't recognize another group. They tend to criminalize one and don't criminalize the other. And sometimes the civil war happens because these groups are fighting against the government, like what is happening in Syria. So you find that civil wars can become total war, because sometimes it gets to that point where people feel as though, you know, they become so disillusioned and disgruntled that when they're going into war within their states, it's almost, and it gets to that point where they really do not care much to destroy things and to destroy people, because at the end of the day, they feel that the social contract they have with the state has been broken. So they feel that they will not hold back. In fact, if you remember, the whole idea of the social contract is that individuals have a contract with the government. So individuals are supposed to obey the government. Individuals are supposed to fall within the laws. Individuals are supposed to instill a level, you know, to behave themselves. Then in return, the government is supposed to bring in order using the police, through the constitution. So it is a symbiotic relationship. But there are instances when a lot of the times the citizen feels that the government is not upholding their end of the bargain. So sometimes this can actually lead to civil war. It starts first with a level of people, you know, a fraction of people getting disgruntled, either because they feel the government is not looking out for their interests, or the government is favoring some people more than others. So you find that civil war, and again, and in the same way, remembering that I said that the government, or rather the government can recognize some groups and does not recognize some groups. And a lot of the times, the groups they recognize are groups which favor or support the government. So therefore, it becomes then that there are two groups, one that supports the government and one that does not support the government, therefore going head to head. So you find that it is very important then to understand what war is, because at the end of the day, when you're discussing war, peace, and world order, the maintenance of the international the maintenance of order in the international system is very important, because at the end of the day, when you're trying to bring, war can bring in disorder. And a lot of the times, war brings in disorder. But once things have been sorted out, it also changes the order of the international system. And so you find that, for instance, after the First World War, for instance, after the end, during the Cold War, we had two superpowers, that is the US and USSR. And there was a bit of disorder at that particular point. At the end of the Cold War, we had one superpower, and the order changed. So when you're discussing war, peace, and world order, and particularly the role of war when it comes to order, is that war creates disorder, but it also changes the order. The other thing about order is that it is often based on common interest for peace, and also common threats such as terrorism. And so you find that sometimes wars can be launched in the name of those common interests. Wars can be launched in the name of fighting terrorism. War can be launched because of certain interests or certain threats. And when it comes to maintenance of order, still you find that it's important. The rules of coexistence are very, very important, because the rules of coexistence mean that, remembering again that the international system is anarchic in nature, and there's no Leviathan. So international organizations and international law try to bring in rules of coexistence, and you find that these rules of coexistence, particularly when it comes to international law, define, or rather they define how states are supposed to behave. And according to Kissinger, these rules define the limits of permissible action. And that's why we even talk about, just and unjust wars, because just and unjust wars is alive to the reality that wars are going to be fought. But there are some wars which are unjust, and there are some wars which are just. And this is based on the limits that are applied. So for instance, if a country does not have just cause and just intention to go into a war, then that is considered an unjust war. But if a country has the right intention and the right cause of going into a war, then that makes it to be a just war. So that shows you that these rules of coexistence try to define the limits of how states are supposed to behave. That in as much as they are sovereign nations, at the end of the day, they have to actually operate within certain limits. But now, for this to work, the role of reciprocity must be applied. Reciprocity means that this is the underlying principle where cooperation and anarchy is able to exist in the international system. States behave in a tit-for-tat way. That is, a state will help those who help them. A state will behave so long as it feels that other states are behaving. But if the other states are misbehaving, or if the other states attack them, or if the other states misbehave, then they're also going to behave in the same. They're going to mirror what that other state is going to do. So the rules of coexistence only are able to work because of the rule of reciprocity. Then finally, institutions, and this is a very liberalist perspective, that institutions help to make the laws. It's the international laws and the rules and the mores that states are supposed to adhere to. More importantly, you find that states are the ones who form these international institutions. So by virtue of forming these international institutions, they legitimize these institutions. And so you find then that these institutions, such as the UN, East African Community, African Union, gain an element of not just legitimacy, but they have power to come up with the rules of engagement that the states are supposed to adhere to. So they have the power of persuasion. They also have the power to mobilize support in the international system. So the maintenance of international order is done because of common interests, because of rules of coexistence, and because of the international institutions that are there to come up with the rules and to ensure that the rules are effective. But at the end of the day, ultimately, war shapes global order, like I mentioned. War creates disorder, and at the end of the war, it also redefines the global order. So that's why we have been able to discuss the topic of war today, because it's important for you to understand then how does war come in to have an effect on global or international order. That's it for today. Thank you.
These televised lectures supplement our robust online learning going on our MKU online platform. You can view more on our televised lectures via our online platform. We are in a digital era, and Mount Kenya University knows this. The following are the steps to follow so as to complete your online application. Download the application form from the website www.mku.ac.ke. Attach copies of your academic certificates and ID. Pay the application fees via M-Pesa pay bill number 270988. Your ID is the account number. 2,000 shillings is the charge for a postgraduate. You can also deposit in the bank accounts provided on the website. Then email all the above to apply@mku.ac.ke.